Okay, Google, thank you. Okay.
Hey,
Hello.
question for you. Can I move your slide to before we look at the Juno 7 section?
Oh yeah, I don't care where you put them. Both
Great.
of them, you mean?
You have two?
Yeah. I had put one kind of toward the beginning.
Oh, no. Leave that one. Just the one at the end. Because that'll give me a chance to pop open my my tablet and join the Zoom with the tablet so that I can share that screen and do the Juno 7 example if we have time for it.
Sure. The only reason I had it there is because you had talked about ways to improve, and that was sort of the theme of that slide. What to do on blind review to get better, essentially.
Oh, yeah. Okay, fine. So then tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to do that. Okay. Cool. All right. That's easy. I'm going to go brush my teeth and then we'll be good to go here.
All right, cool. much time do we have? I'm going to add something to my slide.
We got 10 minutes. You're fine.
You know what I want to add? What I've been doing lately on RC, LR too, but I've been using that method where I have them turn their wrong answer into a right one.
Yeah.
It's so amazing how quickly that exposes misunderstanding. I talked to Gaia a couple of days ago about a sufficient assumption question.
Yeah.
And one of the answer she chose was very close to being a necessary assumption, but not sufficient. And when I pushed her to fix it, she couldn't. And so it's just
Interesting.
like, well, I mean, there's still a gap there. I mean, you know, there's no way around it. She can't like deny that. There's no way to guess your way out of that. Yeah, she never got it. I had to give her the explanation on that one.
It's tough. You know, it's interesting because on the other hand, you know, we talk a lot about it like it being a struggle for people for whom English is a second language. And there we go. But in a lot of ways, for somebody like her, dealing with necessary and sufficient is easy because she doesn't have preconceived notions about what those two words mean.
I
right?
see. Yeah.
You know, it's like the example of the guy who won the international Scrabble tournament, who was Thai, who didn't speak a word of English, and he had literally just memorized the Scrabble dictionary, and so he wasn't predisposed to words that he was familiar with. There was no bias, so.
I'm adding another slide.
Go for it.
It's going to be real short. It's at the end. Just need to say that thing about, I think it's incredibly helpful. If not for the student, for the tutor.
Yeah. But, you know, that also serves the push about becoming your own teacher. How are you supposed to do that, right? Self-instruction is really hard, and one of the things that we do is X, and so in order to, I talk about that with paraphrasing. Why is paraphrasing powerful? Because that's what Keith and I are doing literally all the time when we're with you. We're constantly paraphrasing things and rephrasing things to get you to understand what they are. We're not giving you answers. If we're giving you answers, we're doing a terrible job. I'm gonna shut down my Facebook so I'm not looking at it.
I do it during the thing. I need to put my phone somewhere where I can't get to it.
That's right.
But I can step off screen while you're talking. My cat demands it, as a matter of fact, so. She's learned now that, like, it was probably totally accidental, but she's learned now that if she walks in between me and the screen, that it's gonna get some attention.
That's right.
I'm sure she just walked by a few times and I moved her and she was like, cool. I like that.
I went in and stole my wife's computer screen, so I'm rocking the 2-screen setup tonight. God, I'm so much happier.
Yeah.
So much easier to do a slide presentation with 2 screens.
See, I have to let the cat out. Okay, I think we're good.
Good. All right, I'll start letting people in, but we can wait for a bit here. Back to the beginning. Evening, everybody. We are going to get started in just a bit as we wait for people to come in. Feel free to turn on your video if you like. If you don't want your video on, you don't have to. That's totally up to you. I am going to be using audio and video, obviously, because you have to be able to see me. But if you want your video off, that's totally fine. We got a big crowd tonight, so I want to make sure we wait to get everybody in. I think we're expecting about 35 people. So we're creeping up the list right now. We're up to, I think, 13 or 14 of us. So hang out. If you've got further questions, let us know, and we'll get started in a bit.
You know what occurs to me, Jake, is not everybody's internet junkie. You might want to define TLDR in a literal.
No, it's in there. Don't worry.
Okay.
Despite the immense amount of time that I spend on Reddit, I know not everybody's like me.
I forget that frequently, and my students like, "What are you talking about? Who's Jake?"
Yeah. I know it's just me. It's just me. Yeah. And yet there are so many of these internet acronyms that, like, I see them and I'm like, I don't know what that means. I don't know that one. And I have to look it up and I feel stupid afterwards.
I look it up with no shame. Like Urban Dictionary right on my desktop.
Yeah.
I don't know the kids' lingo. I'm too old for all that.
That's right. Calling it lingo reveals the fact that you're too old for it.
Yeah.
So there you go.
I lost it with the SpongeBob. That's where I started to realize like I was totally out of touch. And that was like 10 years ago, so.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever watched a SpongeBob episode. I'm not sure I have. I know it's a thing.
I imagine it's like the you know those British guys that do the slapstick stuff. I imagine it's like that. Your first impression is like, wait, no, and then maybe if you watch it a few times, you're eventually like, oh, that is kind of clever.
There's deep subtlety to it all.
That's what I hear. I don't, I haven't seen it enough to appreciate it, but
yeah. Well, I will say I was at an an afternoon baseball game with 3,000 summer camp kids. And they played the SpongeBob theme song, and all 3,000 of them screamed it at the tops of their lungs. It was amazing.
That sounds awesome. You know, the only thing that could have been better is maybe like Bob the Builder.
Well, I mean, these days, right? Like my kids, for those who don't know, in the room, I've got two kids. They're 7 and 4, and my kids, the amount of pivoting that they do between intellectual properties, right? They go from Disney princesses on to Thomas the Tank Engine, on to they were really into Octonauts and Wild Kratts and Nature Cat. Nature Cat's great. Those are the Saturday Night Live folks, and it's hilarious. But now they're on this thing called Odd Squad, and I can't keep up. It's just like, and I don't know how they learn about it. Like, it's certainly not happening here. It's amazing.
Well, they get on school every day, and that's just
well, except they're not in school every day now.
Oh,
They haven't been in a school building in 7 months. I mean, it's sort of amazing.
Hey, Jake.
Yeah.
Before we start,
yeah,
send Gay a private message. He's having trouble getting in.
Sure. See if I can.
I would do it, but I still haven't solved my USB shortage dilemma. So
that was the upside to buying this new computer, is that I was able to do that.
I'm working on it.
Copy and find.
I had it in my cart, and
then you didn't do it?
Well, I tried. I had a hassle with the financing, so
It's fair.
It's going to require a phone call.
Yeah, for sure.
And I just don't like phone calls.
That is fair. All right.
You're showing your screen here, by the way.
Oh. We better now?
Yeah.
That's hilarious. I thought I had it on the window. That's funny. Okay, there we go.
Oh, she said she got it.
Never mind.
Good one. You solved that very quickly.
Thank you. Thank you. It wasn't me at all. And now you guys know how many friends I have on Facebook, which is deeply embarrassing.
It's one of those things where probably no one noticed until I said something.
Exactly. And oh, no, but now I've got another one. All right, now I have to open that back up again.
Hey, can you still hear me, Jake?
Yeah, I got you. You're echoing a little bit, though.
Check, check, check.
Come. All right, we are up to 30. I've got one person who's struggling to get in, guys. I'm going to work on that. So give me a second. Let me get her in. And then once I have, we can get started. Over here, screen. And where'd you go? think we are good to go. Ah, there she is. Fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. And I think we've got just about as many people as is possible at this point. Oh, no, there's 32. Those of you who are on the call, if you are not muted, could you please, just so that there isn't any feedback. I am recording the session already, so that you can have both the slideshow and the audio, and we're also going to lay on captions as well. And I will upload it to YouTube with a private link, so you guys can all have access to it after the fact. So don't worry about recording it yourself. I'll take care of that and send out that link once it renders. Okay. Good evening, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to my bedroom closet, which is my home office. Thank you so much for coming. Keith and I are thrilled to have you in this fifth installment of our series of webinars. And today, as you guys all know, we are addressing the issue of reading comprehension. This is the topic over the course of the last 2 weeks that has been by far the most commonly requested. Everybody seems to be struggling with reading comprehension, and everybody seems to be struggling finding resources for reading comprehension to help them improve. And if you talk to the tutoring community, often the communication is that reading comprehension is usually the easiest thing to penetrate up front, but it's the hardest thing to improve on. And because of that, we felt like we wanted to dig in hard on why that is and what we can do to help everybody find something more tangible in reading comprehension than they have now, which sort of feels like read the passage and answer the questions. So this webinar is entitled TLDR, The Power of Paraphrasing. And that's what we're going to discuss today. So let's start off, first of all, with talking about what reading comprehension is at all. First, we need to think about the standardized testing landscape broadly. Every standardized test that's out there, save for one or two really weird ones, has reading comprehension in some form. And those of you who don't know, I've been in standardized test prep for 20 years, and I teach from the middle school level all the way through graduate school level. I teach all of these tests, SSAT and IC and ACT and SAT, GRE, GMAT, LSAT. And on all of these tests, there is reading comprehension. And they're all structured basically the same. They all sort of work the same way, which is that they have a passage, and the questions about that passage have to be tangible and defensible. So what does that mean? From the point of view of the person who writes the test, what that means is you sit at your computer and you pick a passage, some text, and you have to analyze that text for things you can ask about it that can be justified every time somebody takes it, thus standardized, right? This has to be a test that every time it reliably measures a thing, which means the question has to measure the thing the same way every time. That means that the question that they're asking has to be about something specific, and it has to be about something non-analytical, okay? So what I mean by that is that they call it reading comprehension because what they're really asking you is what is on the page. They're not asking you to analyze it. Those of you who are my students or have heard me rail on about this have heard me talk about your first sort of adult English class, which likely happened in middle school, and somebody put an adult book in your hands, whether it was Catcher in the Rye or it was Scarlet Letter was high school, but it was probably Catcher in the Rye or it was Midsummer Night's Dream, and you went in and thought you understood the book, and then your teacher said, no, you missed everything. You didn't get it at all. You made no connections. You don't understand the themes. And then suddenly everybody's on their heels. Oh, I don't understand what's in this text. And we spend the rest of our adult student lives feeling like we don't get what's going on and worried that we've missed it. And so that's the paradigm we take to reading is I'm supposed to draw something more from this than I am. And so that's how we approach standardized testing, because we presume that that's the thing that they're testing us on because that's the thing we do in class. But in fact, it's not that at all. This test and the tests that revolve around reading comprehension are testing you on your ability to read text and understand the words on the page and what they mean. That's why they call it reading comprehension and not reading analysis. So if we think of it as analysis, if we think we're supposed to draw something more meaningful from the text, draw outside inferences, make deductions and conclusions based on the things we know in the world, then we're coming at it from entirely the wrong stance, and we're going to get twisted up and fall down. So we have to have a totally different stance, which is these questions are about what is on the page, not anything else. Okay, so some analogies, because I love analogies and it helps us clarify where we're going. This is what reading comprehension looks like right now, and this is the reason why there's no good material on it. If you look at this map and I tell you, get from Boston to New York, you wouldn't be able to do it. You have no information on anything except the fact that you see everything. It's all there. The trees, the lakes, the rivers, the roads, the houses, we see everything, and it's too much information. We can't parse it all. And if we start to draw connections, well, maybe now I've got a better sense of what's going on this map, but still there's too much information. I can't get from A to B. But instead, if we see this, if we strip away some of the unnecessary information and get to the core of what's happening, the thread, it's very easy to get from Boston to New York. Well, I just follow the blue line. And so that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're trying to get to with reading comprehension. If we look at the whole passage, every time we try to understand the passage, we have to reanalyze the path every time. And that's too much. So instead, we need to make for ourselves a map. And that map should look like a treasure map. Reading comprehension is not just reading, it's a treasure hunt. And the objective is, instead of having a full map with all of the details and all of the elevations, instead we want a map that shows us where we started, where we're going to end up, and some really important landmarks along the way. Which mountain do I turn left at? Where's the river that I cross? If we can think of our reading comp work as we push through a passage as constructing a treasure map for ourselves, then it's really easy to find the treasure. And that's what we want to be able to do. Keith, you want to jump in here?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we got you.
All right. So I didn't add a lot to this slideshow because when Jake mapped out his ideas, it turned out that he and I were in really perfect alignment on almost everything. And so there's just a couple points where I want to add some elaboration, where I have a slightly different perspective on why we're doing it this particular way. Over the years, students have asked me many times, how do I get better at the LSAT? And I have different levels of generality for my answer to that, from how am I going to answer it in a 30-minute consultation? How will I answer that in a 10-hour, series of meetings with a student, or a 20-hour class? I've had many different contexts, but one of the contexts is where I get that single one-off response. I mean, what is like the essence, the single most important thing? And I really believe that it's paraphrasing. And I think that's true for all three sections of the exam. Your ability to take the language in the complex format that it's fed to you and then paraphrase it into something more meaningful, I think is what really separated me from being a good test taker and then ultimately becoming a great test taker and achieving the 99th percentile score that I did. So you notice the quote that I have here, all words are pegs to hang ideas on. I find that to be very profound. And I've read that the English language has something like 100,000 words. And I really believe that that's one of the reasons why it is sort of the preeminent business language, because it is the best tool for expressing ideas in the most nuanced way. And in order to do that, you have to know a lot of words. Now, one of the things about my career is that I've taught a lot of different subjects. I was an MCAT teacher for many years, teaching hard science, like biology and organic chemistry. And then I started moving into what was then the verbal reasoning section. It's now called the CARS section. And ultimately that led to my interest in the in the LSAT. So I became more and more interested in some of the verbal sciences and moved away from some of the hard sciences. And what I noticed from teaching in all these different disciplines was that there seemed to be a very common pattern to learning from the stage of beginner to expert to master in every discipline. Every discipline that I've ever learned in or taught in, I've seen the exact same pattern. And that is that the beginners are trying to learn the vocabulary of the discipline. And so my science students were frequently asking me, what does this word mean? What does that word mean? And even the graduate students are reading complex articles, introducing new terminology that they have to learn to really master the craft. Once you reach that expert level, where say you've got a graduate level understanding, at that point, you're not just dealing with words in terms of definitions. Now, the words have a tremendous amount of context because you've seen those words used in numerous articles. You've been in meetings where you've discussed the words in reference to these articles. You've talked to your professors about these words. And so the words simply take on a whole new meaning that isn't simply tied to that one sentence definition of the word. And so in my way of thinking, the way you think about the words in that discipline shows whether you are the beginner or whether you are the expert. And just to complete the analogy, I believe that once you reach the master level, you don't just know the words of the discipline, but you actually start to create and craft your own. And so you are thinking about the levels on such thinking about the concepts on such a high level that the existing vocabulary can no longer describe it. And now you're reaching for the analogies and saying this word applies to this circumstance too. And it all revolves around, do you know the words? And how many different ways can you formulate those to say or mean or think about the same idea or the same thing? Okay, I'll pass it back to you, Jake.
Yeah, first of all, I love all of this, and the thing that's really important to remember here is that these reading comprehension passages, the likelihood that you would be delivered one that is in your wheelhouse, that's in your expert wheelhouse, is very, very low. The best we can hope for is that it's something that you're familiar with, but how many of us have studied the hard sciences on the graduate level? How many of us are deeply steeped? Well, yeah, okay, fine. How many of us are deeply steeped in literary theory or literary criticism or art criticism or sociology or anthropology, right? These are not things we know a lot about. And there's a lot of advice, and I give this advice that we should go out and read things in various disciplines to get more familiar with the jargon and get more familiar with the vocabulary. But the best we're going to do is to go from beginner to not beginner. We're never going to become an expert. That's not going to happen in the 6 months to a year that we're reading.
You know, what we need to do, Jake, is we need to become expert level in the structure words and the signposting that you're going to talk about later. I agree. We don't want to become experts in each of the disciplines. We want to become experts in reading materials that touch a broad,
right,
array of disciplines.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And so because we can't be expert and we can't rely on our guile anymore, we can't just sort of read it and know what it's about because, hey, it's about opera and I happen to be an expert in opera. Well, then we're going to have to get good at penetrating something quickly and distilling it into something that we can access quickly and understand quickly. And so it's a great transition into what we're going to talk about here. So here's a paragraph. This is a passage. This is a scary looking passage, right? It's a big, long, scary looking hard sciences passage that would typically be on an LSAT. This doesn't happen to come from an LSAT, but it's the right kind of thing. And our typical approach, the standard one that people bring to it when they haven't sort of gone through this, is they say, well, I'm going to read it and I'm going to try to remember as much as I can about what I read. And then I'm going to move on to the questions. I'm going to read those, and then I'm going to try to answer them. That's frightening because we have no anchor. We have nothing to hang, no words to hang our hats on. We're either sifting through our memory or sifting through an enormous body of text, trying to find the thing that they're asking about with no rhyme or reason, no treasure map. And this feels like the way that everybody does it. And how does that make us feel? It makes us feel pretty awful, right? It makes us feel a little bit like this. And we don't want to feel like this. This is not our objective, right? Instead, we want to feel like, oh, I read the thing, I know what it's about, and now I know how to access the question. So how do we do it? And we do it like this. 2 techniques, TLDR and ELI5. So for those who are uninitiated on Reddit, I'll give a quick explanation as to what these are. TLDR stands for too long didn't read. So if you're on some form of listserv or some Reddit page, some subreddit, and somebody posts a huge long story about their friend and what they stole from you and this and that and the other thing, and it's 1,000 words long, people complain because, well, I want to get to the essence of the thing. What is it actually about? And so TLDR is something you can put at the top or at the bottom to say, too long didn't read, my best friend stole my thing, I punched him in the face, who's the jerk? And so that's kind of what we have to do with these things that we're reading. We have to distill them to their sort of finest point, to, you know, what we call in other parts of the test the conclusion. In this case, we can call the thesis of the passage, right? What is the thesis? What are the topic sentences? What is the core of it? ELI5 stands for Explain Like I'm 5, and Explain Like I'm 5 is a subreddit that people can come to and ask really difficult questions about really complex ideas, but get them explained to them in really simple language. Strip out all the jargon, strip out all of the technical language, and get to just the idea. Explain it to me as if I were a 5-year-old so that I can understand it. So these are the 2 techniques we can use to paraphrase. So how do we put them into action? So we start with ELI5. I have a 7-year-old, like I said. My 7-year-old came upon me at the dinner table a couple weeks ago. I had a logic game in front of me, and she said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, it's a game. It's a game for one of these tests." She said, "How does it work?" So I explained it to her. She said, "Can I try one?" I said, "Sure." So she sat down with me, and she's a good reader, and she read all the stuff on the page, but she didn't get it because the language, though she could read the words and sort of knew what the words meant, the language was kind of beyond her. So I started explaining the rules to her. And as soon as I explained the rules in terms that she understood, boom, 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 boom. Oh, that person can't go there because that person has to be after that person. And she got it right away. But it meant framing it in a way that she understood. And we do this in all kinds of academic disciplines. We do it in math, right? We get a word problem, but trying to solve the word problem as a word problem is really hard. But that's why we have algebra. We have a notation for that. If we can condense it into a notation that's easy to penetrate because it's something we use all the time, well, great, I can solve that really easily, right? And we do this with logic games, right? We have rules in logic games, but we condense those to notation. So what we want to be able to do with the text is condense it into something understandable, right? Something that we can access easily and quickly. So here's that horrible paragraph. And this paragraph is about electricity and magnetism and fields and a bunch of people that we've heard of and maybe haven't heard of, and it's hard to read. But what I did was I said, I'm going to take every sentence, and after I read it, I'm going to rephrase it for myself. I'm going to paraphrase it, but put it in terms that a 5-year-old would understand. So I took that first paragraph, and instead of the chosen reference frame determines whether an forget it, right? I wrote this. Whether something is electricity, magnetism, or both depends on how you look at it. Under some circumstances, magnetism comes from electricity, and this guy Feynman talks about that. That's easy. I can understand that, and I got that right from the text. Every sentence, I just rephrased, and I rephrased it in terms that a 5-year-old would get. So then I did it for the second paragraph. I read it one sentence at a time. Fundamentally, fields can be seen to intermix in different frames. Basically, the fields can mix, right? And then I go sentence by sentence. And I did the same, and I turned it into this. And that's pretty easy to penetrate the second time around. And then I did it again for the third. And that's pretty easy to penetrate the second time around. So this is a framework in which we can penetrate the paragraph really easily if we explicitly paraphrase, rephrase the text in our own language. Suddenly, this is not an impenetrable text, as long as I do it explicitly and purposefully.
Hey, Jake.
So that's one. Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No. I was going to move on to TLDR. So.
Yeah. There's a point I want to make on a couple slides later on the TLDR, but Before I forget, I just wanted to point out that there is this really fascinating thing on Netflix right now about the Challenger, and they talk about Feynman quite a bit at the end because he was on the committee that investigated this whole thing. And I know it has nothing to do with this, but seriously, awesome,
Okay.
well-produced thing. I recommend it to everybody. I mean, I was a little kid when that happened, and I learned a lot in that Netflix special. I was just riveted. I
Cool.
couldn't get any work done. So anyway, Feynman reminded me of it. Continue on.
So anyway, that's ELI5, right? It's simplify all this stuff into something that is into language that you know, right? And Becca brings up a good point in the chat, and I'm glad to address it because we're there. Yes, in order to be able to do that, you have to understand what you're reading, and that's difficult. You're right. But one of the things that's important is to recognize what is and is not critical to what you're reading, right? There's a lot of jargon in there, right? If I step back a slide here, let me step back a slide, right? The sentence here says, a famous example of the intermixing of electric and magnetic phenomena in different frames of reference called them, right? There's a lot of text there. Do I know what a frame of reference is? Sorta, right? Do I know whether there's subtlety to the idea of intermixing? I don't know. I'm not a physicist, right? I've studied physics. I studied in college, but I'm not a physicist. I don't know the details. But what I do know is that essentially they're saying there's an example of mixing and that Einstein cited it, and it's called in his thing on special relativity. So Einstein cited a thing about mixing, right? And I can go sentence by sentence and say, this is what I read. I will get to the idea of doing this quickly later on, so don't worry. But we'll put a pin in that and we'll come back to it. I recognize that this seems like an enormous task. The objective here is not to get you to do this on an actual section. I'm demonstrating the rule, and then we'll get to what to actually do when you're doing an actual paragraph.
I have some thoughts to add later on too about how to speed up this process. And so the gist of it is that you can't do it quickly until you can do it slowly. So start there.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the ELI5 portion of this. But there's also the TLDR portion, and that's kind of what we're talking about speed. I don't have time to do all of this, right? What does this mean? We have to think about, let's go back to when we were 12 or 13 and we were taught how to write an essay. What we're supposed to do is start with an outline, right? I have an idea. That's called my thesis. I'm going to support my thesis with 3 points, right? Point 1, that supports it. Point 2, point 3. Those are each going to be a paragraph. In each of my paragraphs, I support that idea with some evidence. And then I support that evidence with an explication. Why does that evidence support my idea? So if I can build an outline, fleshing out a paper is easy. So I need to have those points, that hierarchy of ideas. I have a thesis, which is my big idea at the top, 3 smaller ideas that support it, and then evidence that supports each of those. On this, we're given the paper already. We have to figure out what the outline was. And so that's the objective with TLDR. What's the outline? Each passage will have a thesis, a central idea, a central conceit. You need to figure out what that is. Each central conceit is supported by points. And those points are generally divided by paragraph. We have to figure out what those are as we go. And each of those points has evidence to support it. Those are the trees and the rivers and all of the things that you don't include in your treasure map. And by the way, this sounds a whole lot like what we do on logical reasoning, right? When we look at a paragraph in logical reasoning, when we look at a stimulus, job 1 is find the conclusion. That's exactly what we do on reading comp. When I read a paragraph, job 1 is to figure out what is the topic sentence of this paragraph? What is the point of this paragraph? Can I find it? Can I headline that paragraph, right? That's the idea here. So when we do TLDR, what we're really doing is doing mini logical reasonings every time, mini arguments every time. What is the central conceit, the topic sentence of the paragraph? So here's our passage again. And instead of simplifying the language, I'm just going to find the signpost, right? I'm going to find where the conclusion of each paragraph is, where the topic sentence of each paragraph is. And in the first one, it's that first sentence. The chosen reference frame determines whether the phenomenon is viewed, blah, 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 blah. Because the other two sentences serve that, right? In the second paragraph, hey, guess what? It's the first sentence again. Fields can be seen to intermix in different frames. And then it goes on to talk about why that's true. The third paragraph does the same. It says a thing, and then it goes on to say why that's true. So when we look at how we go about finding conclusions in LR, we can do the same thing in reading comp and identify conclusions in paragraphs, which we call topic sentences. We can identify topic sentences in paragraphs by saying the opinion. Why is it true? The why is the fluff. It's the evidence. It's the premises. But the conclusion is the opinion part of it. It's the stated thesis of the paragraph. So that's how we do the TLDR. And so one by one, paragraph by paragraph, I can say, look, these were the conclusions of the 3 paragraphs, for sure, because each of the paragraphs serves to demonstrate that those things are true. So if that's, again, if this is the stance we take when we read the passage, then it's much easier to say, look, I'm looking for the conclusion of the paragraph. And there it is. So then the question is, which one's better? Which one should we do? And the answer is that we should be doing both. And we should be doing them simultaneously. Because TLDR gives you the structure of the passage, but ELI5 allows you to access the information quickly without laboring through retranslating it every time you look at it. You need to construct the treasure map for yourself, because if you don't understand the passage, how do you know where to go back in the passage to find your information? But you don't have to understand it at a deep level. You only have to understand its structure. Here's the big conclusion, the big thesis of the passage, and here are 3 paragraphs which each support it, or the third one goes against the second one, and then the author comes to some sort of resolution about it at the end. We already do this on the test. We do TLDR on logical reasoning. We find the conclusion. We find premises. We find major and minor premises. We do that already. We do ELI5 on logic games, right? We distill our rules into a rule bank, into a list, so that we don't have to go back to the written rules every time. And the reason reading comp is challenging is because it's asking you to do both simultaneously. It's the pinnacle. It seems like the easy one because it's just reading. It's actually the hard one because it's marrying all of these principles into one. You have to use your deductive reasoning. You have to use your ability to draw inferences, but you also have to use your ability to paraphrase over and over and over and over again in order to understand not the entirety of what you're reading, but only the essence of it. Can I identify what that conclusion is? And then can I express it in a way that's simple to me? So what order should you, well, first of all, before we get there, let's talk about why we do this. We do it because we need those anchors, those waypoints on our treasure map, in order to understand the thing broadly. And the reason I put the music up here is if we think about music, guitar players, piano players, singers, whoever it is that's sort of doing music in a way that's not literal on the page, they're not thinking about every note. They're thinking about broad strokes. They're chunking information, if anybody understands that concept, right? They're taking large pieces of information and thinking about them as groups, as chords. And we do the same thing when we read, right? If we read a paragraph, we distill it to its essence. We chunk it. We think about it as one idea. And the other part of it is telling the story of the passage, right? If we can say, look, I know what story that passage told me. It was that there were moose and the moose migrated. And when the moose migrated, this other thing happened. And this is what the scientists sort of thought about it. And I don't need to know all the jargon and I don't need to know all the details, but I need to know how they got from where they are to X marks the spot and find the treasure. Keith, any thoughts before we move on?
I added a slide while you were saying that, so I'll mention it later.
Awesome. So Keith is right that this is not something that comes quickly. This is not a technique that you're like, oh, I've learned that now. Great, I can just put it into play. This is something you have to practice, and you have to practice with intention. And those who have been at our other webinars and have sort of seen what we've talked about in terms of reviewing, you understand that to improve on this test, more than any other standardized test out there, takes a lot of time. And it takes a lot of time looking back at the work we've already done to analyze our own performances, to go into the video room and look at it, right? And so in a timed section, you might not be super skilled at this right now. There may be one part of this that you're not good at. I can identify, but I'm not good at rephrasing in a way that works for me, or one of the other pieces. And so this is an opportunity in blind review, but certainly in your third review of a section, to say, I'm actually going to explicitly and literally write out an ELI5 TLDR version of this passage, right? One simple sentence per paragraph that tells the full story of this paragraph. And when I do that, I'm going to go to the answers and I'm going to say, oh man, I know where everything is, right? And we're going to get on to the rest of what you do about reading comp, but it's really important to realize that this isn't something you can just pick up, right? Like sports, like music, like anything, you learn a new technique, but it takes employing that technique over and over and over again. Those who were on the Facebook group this morning saw a post about logic games addressing just this thing. And there are those who advocate going through a single logic game 10 times and doing it for all of them, doing 500, 600, 1,000 games to master games. Do I think that's the only way to do it? No, but that will certainly get you there, right? And repetition is enormously valuable. It has to be directed and it has to be done with intention, but it is a critical part of what we do.
You know, Jake, my own experience combined with the power of blind review plus the foolproofing method, a lot of that was what got baked into the cake of my triple review thing that we teach together. And so I agree with you. I think 10 times is too many. And if you guys have attended our webinars before, you know, I think the magic number is 3. And I think the reason for that is that you can have a different focus each of the 3 times. And I think the exact same thing for reading comprehension passages. The magic number is 3, provided that you're focusing on a different aspect of the process each of the 3 times. And if you want more information on that, our triple review webinars where we really get into that in more detail.
Yeah. And before I move on, there was a question in the chat about anchoring. Anchoring is a bit about putting up those signposts along your path, right? It's saying, I know what happens at various points in this story, right? I know that by the time I get to the end of the first paragraph, I've heard about the moose. And by the time I get to the second paragraph, or in the middle of the second paragraph, that's where they introduce the scientists, right? And if we're merely reading a body of 800 words and trying to absorb it all, we're not going to absorb any of it. It's not going to happen. There's too much information there for us to try to grab onto if we try to remember everything. So instead, we have to narrate our own experience as we read it. Say, okay, this is introductory. Oh, that's where we hit the, oh, no, sorry, this is the conclusion. Great, or that's my thesis. And then here are 2 examples of that thesis. Great, so that was the moose example and that was the seal example. And now we move on to where they introduce the literary critic who says that all of this is ridiculous. Okay, great. So now I've got the story of my passage. And those anchor points are where you say, this is where this happens, this is where this happens, this is where this happens. And the power of that is going to be evident in a second. Because this is only the beginning, right? Because the hard part here is not the reading. We all can read, and to varying degrees, we understand the words that are there. Obviously, there's technical stuff in there, but we can all read the passages. The question is, what do we do about answering the questions? A lot of the material out there tells you to categorize the question types and to memorize the question types. These are the 15, 20, 84, depending on what book you read, kinds of questions you will see on reading comp, and this is what they tend to ask you. And that's fine, but the truth is that there's real power in paraphrasing here as well. We have to paraphrase everything, not just the passage, but the question stems as well. And I'll show you why. So this is a question stem we've all seen, right? We all know this one, and it's there all the time. But if every time we see it, we read in our head, which of the following most accurately expresses the main point of the passage, we're filling our brain with the necessity to analyze the words each time we read it to get to the point of what the question is. And the idea here is to understand what the point of the question is right away. Get rid of all the non-lexical words and get to the heart of it, right? And the heart of it is, what is the main point? When I see this question, I don't say to myself, which of the following most accurate? No, I have an internal dialogue. Well, that one happens to be a monologue. Nobody's talking back to me. But I have that monologue, and that monologue is, what is the main point? What is the main point? What is the main point? Over and over in my head, I'm demanding that I remember what it is that I'm looking for. Here's another one we see all the time. Which of the following is most analogous to? We know what analogous means, right? But instead of saying that to ourselves, which of these is the same as? We explain it to ourselves like we're 5. We rephrase this question in a way that we don't have to stop and reconsider it. Why do we translate the logic games rules? We could just memorize the language and then we wouldn't have to write them down again. And wouldn't that save us time? And the answer is no, it doesn't. It takes us more time to go back to the rule bank and reanalyze what it says there so that we can remember what it is. And it's the same thing here. Yes, we understand what the question stems are asking us, but if we put it in our own words and words that are simple and powerful and memorable, we don't have to keep rereading the question. Instead, we read it once, we know what it's asking, and we demand of ourselves that we remember that question, not the one that's written on the page. According to the passage, and this is where it really gets powerful, all questions are built on some basic, what they call interrogative stems, right? Who, what, when, where, why, and how. And on the LSAT, they don't really talk about who or where, but they always talk about what, and they always talk about why, and they sometimes talk about how. And so according to the passage means, what does the passage say?
You know what's
Right?
funny about this one, Jake? According to the passage, yeah, that's, what else are we going to base it on? It's sort of superfluous. I find it funny. It's kind of like on logic games. Which of the following is a complete and accurate list of blah, blah, blah? When would they ever ask me for an inaccurate list? I mean, it's such a preposterous thing to say. It's preposterous to say, according to the passage. And so you have to read into it a little more and think about, well, why is that there? And it serves as sort of a psychological anchor for me that if you don't continue to drive this point home, students will go on this analytical chaos. Yeah. They'll go off on the deep end. You have to keep bringing them back to the point that it has to be based on the passage. And even with those anchors, we continue to forget. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, and actually, you know, to bring up logic games again, which is really super valuable here to drive this point home, that when you see that, which of the following is a complete and accurate list, how many of us, once we've done 4, 5, 6, 10, 15 games, actually read that question anymore? We don't have to read that question stem. We know what it's saying already. We're just supposed to test those iterations against our rules. So we don't bother reading it. We shove that stuff away. If you can get to the point where you see a question and you know what it's asking you, and in your mind, you don't read according to the passage. You just read, oh, what does it say? Let me go find that thing. Right? And that's the thing that's really key, that we get to the point where we can look at this question, the author's attitude toward whatever it is can best be described as, and we know right away what that means is, how does the author feel about it? We're looking for the way he feels or his tone about it, right? That we don't have to read all those words. Instead, we've got a core idea of what the question is. And the questions are what, why, and how. The why one is really important. And this question stem in particular, this type of question stem, in the context of the passage, the author's primary purpose of writing something is, this is a really, really common kind of question that people get wrong all the time because they forget that what it's asking is not what does it say, but why does it say it? What function does it play in the passage? Right? And that's really, really, really important to remember. That's why we distill them to what, why, or how, because then we can identify, is this a why question? Primary purpose means why.
You know, I paraphrase this one step further, Jake. I'll say, why is it there? Well, it has to be there to have some reference to the main point.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it shouldn't be there if it doesn't relate to the main point in some way. So I bring it even one step more concrete and say, well, what relationship does this idea have to the main point? Does it support it? Does it contradict it? Does it show a limitation of the main point? And once you've identified the relationship, I think that's what you were getting at before. It's not what does it say about this thing, but when you're answering the question of why did they say that, what they're really driving at, in my opinion, is how does that connect back to the main idea? And if you haven't read the passage in a way where you're building this map of main ideas, where do you go from there? You don't really have the framework or the anchor to start to make that connection to prephrase the answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, to draw the analogy to LR, right? Why means, is it the conclusion? Is it a topic sentence that serves the conclusion? Is it a piece of evidence that connects the topic sentence to a premise, to a fact and evidence, or is it that fact itself, right? So it's part of the same deductive framework that is in LR. It's just in a longer passage that has multiple paragraphs put together. But that's all it is. It's why is it there? What role does it play? What part of the deductive circuit does it play? One other possible question stem that has I mean, they all have rephrasable wording, but it can be inferred. And this is one that people complain about all the time. What do they mean it can be inferred? That means I have to bring outside information. No, remember, this is reading comprehension. It's not reading analysis. There is no outside information we need, right? It's merely that one of these things is easiest to prove based on the passage, that this is an idea that based on the information that's in the passage can be plugged into the circuit, or more literally, the passage will talk about it and it will serve a little bit like an assumption in an LR. It's an idea that is there, it just hasn't been quite connected the way we would want to connect it in logical reasoning. But that's all that this is. It's no further than that. We're not drawing any new conclusions about it. But it is, which of these is easiest to prove, or what does the passage say about it? It's the same thing. And so when we get to the point where we're really good at rephrasing our question stems, we then have to get really good at prephrasing our answers. And so one of the things that Keith and I talked about this morning when we were sort of walking through this was the framework of answer choices, and that when you've got 5 choices in front of you in a reading comp, 1 or 2 of them are going to be irrelevant, but the other 3 are likely going to be true. They're going to be ideas that are true. And it's really important to remind yourself at every turn that being true doesn't make it correct. That it's there, that it's an idea that's in the passage, doesn't mean that it actually answers the question. You know, this is a bit like what Keith was talking about. It's the right answer to the wrong question. It's information that does answer a question. It's just not the question being asked. And so it's so important that we prephrase, because it's so easy to get drawn into true answers. They're really good at writing true answers that don't answer the question. So we don't want to presume to know before actually going back to the passage. And when I first introduced this to 16-year-olds who were doing SATs and ACTs, well, this was 20 years ago, but I forced them to take a yellow Post-it note and put the Post-it over the answer choices. And I would not let them take it off until they had been able to accurately express their answer to me out loud. And this is an exercise that you can do, right? In your blind review, put a Post-it note over the answer choices. Force yourself back to the passage to prephrase that answer.
You know, one of my my students is here, Cole, and he can attest to the fact that when I'm working with a student, they always want to go to the answer choices faster than I do. Even advanced students, Cole is scoring really well and could potentially hit 170 on the October exam. And even at that stage, when we talk about questions, he's usually saying to me, well, I chose C because, and I'm saying, hold on, I can't tell you why C is wrong when I can't even prephrase what I think would constitute a correct answer yet. And so I'm always pumping the brakes on, in my observation over the years, because I've had that same interaction so many times with my students, I've come to believe that that's simply a characteristic of a top test taker, to be able to have the patience to think through the question and formulate the answer before that runaway train takes you to the answer choices. The answer choices are so attractive. They're there, and you know you can go read them. And what are you hoping for, really? I always tell my students that they're hoping the correct answer, you know, jumps out and says, "Here I am," or that they get struck by inspirational lightning. But the LSAT writers are way too clever for that. And so the more that we can develop a framework of what will constitute a right answer versus what will constitute a wrong answer, I think that's when you really start to become expert level test taker.
Sure, and you know, we again, you know, I've said it probably 10 times already tonight. This is very easy and tangible on games and on arguments, right? In an LR, when we are given a flaw question, there is drill after drill in every training material out there for how to go about generating flaws, and we do it, right? We say, what's the conclusion? Why is the conclusion true? Okay, so what? Right? Well, those are the premises. Okay, but what if this, and what if that, and what if this other thing? How can we weaken this thing? What are the gaps in this thing? Is there a loophole? Is there a you know, some gap in language, right? We do this already in LR, but people don't do this for reading comp. Instead, they just sort of say, well, which of these makes sense given that question? No, we go back and we find the answer, right? That's why we built a treasure map. Right? Because we have the treasure map, now it is really easy to find our answers. Why? Because we remember what the treasure map is. And I bet each of you, if you're honest with yourself, can probably think back half an hour to that Einstein passage with the electricity and the magnetism, and you probably remember some of the structure of that thing. You know, did everybody remember that it was 3 paragraphs? Probably, because I hammered it home. Did everybody remember that that first paragraph said that things can be electricity, magnetism, or both? That the second one said, no, it's usually both, and that's why. And that the third one said, oh, Einstein talked about it, 2 sides of the same coin, right? And that was the treasure map I built. Nobody even read the passage, and I'm sure some of that stuck with you. And at this point, having that treasure map, I now know that I know where the main point's going to be. I now know where things are laid out in my paragraph so I can access them easily. I now know sort of what the tone is because no opinions have been expressed. So this is a pretty removed analytical tone. And if I ask for an inference about another concept, I know things that are relatively similar to that concept because I've narrated them to myself. So I should be in pretty good shape to be able to look at this massive thing, right? And say, okay, well, where's my main point? Well, everything was about the mixing of electricity and magnetism. So it's probably this thing, unless it's this thing. Which one is addressed in all 3 paragraphs? Well, the mixing is the thing that's been addressed in all 3 paragraphs. So that's sort of the main point, right? You can look at it 3 ways, but usually it's mixing. And if I asked, why is, well, you know, in the context of the passage, the paper written by Einstein is mentioned in order to, right? So why do they mention Einstein? Well, they mention Einstein down here. So I know where to go already because I knew it was in my 3rd paragraph. And I said, well, the 3rd paragraph said that Einstein showed that you could mix it in a paper and that it was 2 sides of the same coin. So that seems to serve the conclusion pretty directly. So it seems like evidence to serve the conclusion, and I can go back and justify that based on the text I see. But it's those anchor points that we already pre-established that allow us to go right back to where that information was and say, now I know it's there, or mixing is talked about in all 3. And so I can go to those places and say, I remember where that was. I don't have to search through the whole thing. I don't have to, you know, chop down trees to find the one beautiful rock, which is where I turn left. I know where I turn left because I got rid of the trees earlier. And so this is the objective of that simplification of the passage. And so this is sort of where we land here, right? How do you get better at this, right? Because we all suck at it to begin with, because it's really hard. But to improve at it, we have to start with saying, look, I don't need this on every question, right? There are some questions I'm going to get right regardless. And my answer to that is always, yeah, sure, but you don't know which ones those are. You don't know which ones you're going to get right and which ones you're going to need this for. So have the presumption be that you need this for every question, right? Because you don't know which ones are going to trip you up. And for now, you have to start doing the dialogue with yourself. You have to script this for yourself. When I do a reading comp, I paraphrase the passage, I rephrase questions, I pre-phrase my answers. And then you have to start having the conversation with yourself. What would Keith say? What would Jake say? What would they tell me to do here? They would tell me to rephrase the question. So what is the question asking? Do it out loud. It feels stupid. So shut yourself in a room and make sure the cat can't hear you. But do it in a way that you can actually hold yourself accountable to doing it. And you're going to find that you understand a lot more of it than you think you do. And that a lot of it that you think you needed to understand, you don't need to understand. And I give you one sort of reference point here. For those in the room who took the ACT, you'll remember there's a section on the ACT that's called science. It's the last section of the test. It is notoriously the hardest section on the test. And the reason it's hard is there are a lot of questions about 7 different experiments. And you have to answer 5 to 7 questions about each of those experiments. And the first time anyone reads it, they spend all this time trying to understand the science, right? They look at this thing, it's like, oh my God, there's all this science going on, and I need to know what it's about. And the truth is, you don't need to know any of it. It doesn't matter whether you understand the science, what the experiment is about, because the questions only ask you to find the information, which means you don't need to hang on to any of the stuff that's there. If they don't require you to know it, why are you trying to remember it? Why are you trying to understand it? Why are you trying to analyze it, right? So on reading comp, yes, there's information there that you may not understand, but that may be okay. You may not need to understand it. What you need to do is understand the structure of the paragraph. Where is everything? As long as you can identify those waypoints, it actually doesn't matter whether you understand the nuances of their literary criticism or why it is that, you know, the moose had to do X, Y, or Z, or what that chemical is. Those things are unimportant. Keith, some tips on blind review in order to reinforce these concepts.
Hey, Jake, can you back out and refresh? Because I added a slide here. It occurred
yeah,
to me.
Sure.
It occurred to me that when you were talking about finding main points, there were some questions about that. And I actually have some really direct strategies for doing it, and I thought I would share them here. And then we got a question in the chat about how to start getting faster at all this, and I want to address that with my blind review slide. So I'll try to work through these as quickly as possible.
There you go.
You know, I talk to students a lot about finding main points because this has been like the core of my strategy for a long time. And my rationale was that you get one shot at the main point question, and you can never go back and reread the passage again. The time constraints are just too tight. And so you have to make a choice on your first read, which things am I going to focus on? And if you choose to focus on the details or the wrong things, you sacrifice that main point question every time. And for what, you know, for what gain? So my take is we want to get the main point question right every time. And that entails getting really good at finding main points. And so here's my tips for doing that. First of all, what I tell my students is that if you've gotten to the end of the paragraph before you've considered what the main point is, you're already sunk. You waited too long. This for me is a sentence by sentence. I don't want to call it an analysis because Jake says it's not analytical, but it's a question that I repeat after each sentence. And it's become so ingrained in my strategy to do this that it's simply become how I read, where I don't have to articulate the complete question every time, but I certainly, every sentence that I read, I sum it up, make sure I understand it, and reflect on its relationship to the sentence before and what I already think the main point of the passage or the paragraph is. So that leads me to my second point. How can I think I already know? It's because I go into the paragraph believing that I already know where the main points are. Our conventions in English are that the main point is going to be at the beginning or the end. And therefore, the very first sentence I read, my assumption is I just read the main point. And I need some evidence to the contrary before I start backing off that idea. And so unless the first sentence in the paragraph is highly factual, like a statistic that really can't be argued, unless it's that straightforward, I'm thinking the first sentence is a strong contender for the main point until I've got some evidence to the contrary. And one of the, you know, if it's not the first sentence, then my thinking goes, all right, well, then it's probably at the end. Let me see how the paragraph plays out. and I continue my analysis to sentence 2. The paragraphs that I think are the trickiest, I call them the sandwich paragraphs, where they give you the main point first, give you a bunch of complicated stuff, and then repeat the main point at the end. And for me, the difficulty was that I know it's at the beginning or the end, and I'm kind of juggling back and forth between two sentences that essentially mean the same thing. And so what I've noticed is that when authors do this, what they tend to do is give you sort of this general main point first. Just here, let me give you a softball so you know what I'm going to argue here. And then once you get the full crux of the argument, you're sort of primed for a re-articulation of the main point that is more nuanced. And so you have to take your pick. Am I going for the more nuanced version, or am I going for the easier version? Our strategy here is explain it like I'm 5. So I direct my students, you head back up to the top. You want the more general or the simple main point. That's going to be the better one to refer to when you've got your choice between a really technical one versus a more general one.
Yeah, before you go on,
Sure.
This is super valuable. And, you know, to go back to the idea of the middle school 5-paragraph essay, the other part of that was that they taught us this paragraph structure. I don't know if anybody remembers this, and there are plenty of acronyms for it. Some people call them TEAL or TEAK, or, you know, depending on what you call things. But generally, when you learn to write a paragraph, the first sentence was the topic sentence. What is this paragraph about? Sometimes you would flesh that out a little bit in the second sentence. Then you would give evidence to support that topic sentence. Then you would explicate that evidence. Why does that evidence support the topic sentence? And then you would conclude. And so if we hold the authors to that standard, 80% of the time, the first sentence is going to be the topic sentence of that paragraph. And it's the same thing that we do in LR. We say, what's the thing here that's not a statistic, not a fact, but rather an analysis of that fact, an opinion on that fact, right? In the case of electromagnetism, oftentimes you can see fields as being mixed, right? That's not data on the fields, right? That's saying you can see it that way. That's an analysis. That's fuzzier. It's more general. Then we give details on why, right? Evidence answers the question why. And the conclusion should generate the question why. Why is that true? And usually that's the first sentence.
Okay, good stuff. So in addition to the general forms of English language, the paragraph structures that are most common, I use a few other tools as well, ultimately leading to, you know, the actual structure and relationship of the ideas. But that's sort of the hardest one to get at. So I'll deal with that one last. But the next thing I think about is the semantics. I'm looking for the author's signposting of terms like therefore, thus, in conclusion. But, you know, we have to always be aware of subsidiary conclusions. So that's not the end of my analysis. And actually, what I find to be sort of more helpful than the conclusion indicators, to be perfectly honest, are the premise indicators.
Yeah.
When the author starts using language like because, since, after all, or for example, my mind starts to think this is a supportive point. And what's even more important is that the main point has probably already passed. If they're telling me because, you know, like what is that point supporting? Usually the structure is that the main point has come immediately before that statement. So those are some of the semantic signposts that I look for. The other thing that I do is I use a lot of tools from LR. I really got good at RC by translating my skills from LR. Once I mastered LR, that's when I was able to start penetrating RC. And so my strategy for RC is basically to treat each paragraph as if it were an LR argument, and I'm looking for the conclusion. And so I use all of those skills. I look at all the relationships between the ideas in the sentence, and really what I'm looking for is which of these ideas is most supported by the others. And I say most supported, that, you know, relates back to my previous point that we can have subsidiary conclusions. We can have something that is supported, but then is used to support further ideas and therefore isn't the most supported idea and isn't the main conclusion of that argument or that paragraph. Now, even with this framework in place, I still have a lot of students who struggle, and I still find that some paragraphs are really difficult for me to tease out the main point. Often when that's the case, it's because it's a descriptive paragraph, and frequently that occurs. It's like the introductory paragraph, the first one of the passage. So I've got two pieces of advice for descriptive paragraphs where they're not actually making an argument. They're just sort of telling you different things or facts about the world. First of all, if I can find what I consider to be the most general description, I will identify that as the main point of the paragraph. So for example, if I said, you know, Feynman did a lot of cool stuff, and then I go on to mention some of his work in physics, and I mention the fact that he was on the Challenger committee that investigated that, those are specific examples. Sure, they're facts. This is not a persuasive paragraph, but those are specific examples that are less general than that statement that he did a lot of cool stuff. And so I'm more focused on those general, remember, tell me like I'm five, explain it like I'm five. That's what I'm really looking for. The next one, I debated where to put this in the, let me back up for the descriptive one for a second. When it's the introductory paragraph, this is where I have some of the most difficulty. Sometimes I'll read that paragraph and just think, I don't know, there are a number of different ways I could go from here as a writer. I could take that first paragraph and advance this kind of argument. I could take it a different way and advance a totally different argument. And because I have that sort of ambiguity about where the passage is going, that also leads to some ambiguity about my opinion about what the main point of that paragraph was. That's not an uncommon situation for me to find myself in after the first paragraph. So what I do is I start reading that first sentence of the second paragraph and I see, well, where did they go? You know, where do they pick up from paragraph one? And usually I know instantly, oh, we're talking about that now? Well, then that means that the purpose of paragraph one was to set it up. And now I know which idea in paragraph one was most complementary to setting up that next topic for paragraph two. And so the point that I wanted to make here was that the advantage you have, although students don't see this as an advantage, the advantage you have on reading comp that you don't have on LR is you have a way to check your conclusions. If you pick the wrong conclusion for paragraph one, or if you just can't decipher the conclusion, you have paragraph two and paragraph three to start thinking about that thread, because whatever the main point of paragraph one is, it better jibe with the main points of paragraph two and paragraph three, or else you've really kind of missed something along the road.
Yeah, and if I'm going to chime in quickly, the other thing that's so powerful about realizing paragraph one doesn't have a conclusion is that it indicates that the first sentence of paragraph two is likely the thesis of the whole darn thing, right? Because when you think about the outline of a 5-paragraph essay, right, you're supposed to have this hourglass shape, right? That you're supposed to start very broadly with context, right? You're supposed to narrow it into presenting some form of conflict, and you're supposed to land on a thesis. And if the thesis isn't there at the end of the first paragraph, it's going to be the first sentence of the second paragraph for sure, right? So it means that you can almost say, well, you know what? The first paragraph really just serves as context for the rest. So the point of the first paragraph is not one thing. The point of the first paragraph is context for the thesis.
So there was a question in the chat, how do we know if it's persuasive versus descriptive? And that leads perfectly to my next point, which is that when I'm evaluating what is the main point of the paragraph, one of the questions that I start asking, because my students will still push back sometimes and say, how can you know when you haven't read everything yet? I mean, I'm on sentence 2 and you're asking me to tell you whether I think this is the main point or not. Well, one of the bases on which I make that decision is whether the ideas are framed as opinions versus facts. And so I'll look at sentence 1, and the analytical framework that I use is, was that an opinion or was it a fact? And if it's a fact, remember I said earlier, you maybe didn't understand why, but I said if that first sentence is something extremely factual, like a statistic, I'm going to start to doubt that the first sentence is the main point. And I'm going to start to doubt that that typical structure is the structure of this paragraph, because facts just don't make good persuasive conclusions. You don't argue to me that a fact is true. You go show me the empirical evidence. You know, like if I want to tell you that it's 78 degrees here in Dallas today, I'm not going to construct a verbal argument for that. I'm going to take you over to my thermostat and show you what it says. It's an empirical question. So I look at these sentences and start to make determinations. Are they telling me something that could be debated versus something where if we just had the information, we would know for sure? And if it's a fact, I start to think that's not the main point. That's probably supporting evidence. And if it's an opinion, strong contender for the main point. Now, the question that I really wanted to answer here from the chat, which was, how do we know if the paragraph is persuasive versus descriptive? Well, descriptive paragraph won't have any opinions. A persuasive paragraph will have some, or ideally one main opinion supported by other facts, although it's never that cut and dry. And I want to give you a quick example just to show you how this isn't a magic solution. Think about a statement like, many people believe that the earth is flat, or something like that. Or no, let me give a more opinionated example. Many people believe that it's wrong to, jaywalk. Okay, so morally wrong to jaywalk. So we have two sort of components to this sentence, which is that many people believe something. That's a fact. It's an empirical question that we can't debate about. The only solution to answering that question is we have to go ask people what they believe. And if we think they're telling us the truth, we'll have our answer. But the second half to the question, is it morally wrong to jaywalk, isn't an empirical question. That's an opinion. And so we can have a sentence that is both opinion and fact. And so I want to point out that when I'm making this analysis, was that sentence an opinion or a fact? It's terrific when my answer is, oh, clearly a fact, but that's usually not the case. Usually I'm kind of straddling the fence and saying, I think it could be both, but the author stated it in a very factual way. He didn't say, well, it kind of seems like jaywalking is immoral. He says, given that jaywalking is immoral, blah, 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 moved on. Taking it almost as an assumption, given the language of the statement. So I don't just look at the information itself. I'm also looking at how it's couched by the author. Does he want me to just go along with this? Or is he using qualified language like, it seems that, I conclude that, my team believes that? When he starts introducing that kind of language, I say, not only is this an opinion, but the author is also signaling to me that this is the crux of the opinion of the paragraph. And so I start to cue in on that kind of language. And go ahead, jump in.
Before you go on, despite our best intentions at analyzing, we still find ourselves looking at a sentence and saying, I'm not sure if this is a conclusion or not. And we need a trigger. And that's why I said, when you think about the question stems boil down to a trigger, right? It's the same thing at LR when we're looking for the conclusion. The conclusion raises the question, why, right? So a statement of opinion will make you ask why. And if the answer to why is further evidence in the paragraph, then that's the topic sentence, that's the conclusion. If the answer to your why is, well, because they do, or because it is, well, then it's a fact, and it's not a conclusion, right? Many people believe that jaywalking is wrong. Why? Well, because many people believe it. So the answer to that why question is the fact that it's true. I didn't ask why they think jaywalking is wrong. I'm asking, why do many people believe it? Well, because many people believe it. How do you know that that's true? Because it is. So that's not a conclusion. Conclusion should raise the question why, and then you have to justify the why with facts and evidence from the rest of the paragraph.
Consider this, Jake. I find this to be really interesting, that when you think about sentences that have this kind of ambiguity, is there an opinion here, or is there a fact here? And we're talking about, many people believe that jaywalking is wrong. For me, I would look at that sentence and I would say, I can qualify that as a fact. I can qualify that as an opinion. And therefore, what I really need to know is what comes next. And if the next sentence starts giving me statistics about people's beliefs, I mean, that's an odd paragraph, but I'm going to go back and say, they're trying to support that first half of the sentence. Or maybe that's a bad example. If they're talking about, an extension of people's beliefs, I might think that the first sentence was given to me for the factual content of the people's beliefs. But if the second sentence moves on to an argument about the moral justifications for jaywalking, I might go back and completely reinterpret why I think the first sentence was there.
Right. Though it certainly could be that what you'll end up with is a conclusion at the end, right? And that the conclusion at the end could be, so ultimately those people that believe it are mistaken in their belief because such and such.
Sure,
and then
sure.
It turns out that the conclusion is that they were mistaken. You're right that we should go on to the next sentence to determine where that sentence was pointing, and maybe it was just a turn of phrase that they didn't intend to be there. But ultimately, right, like, everything that's in that the rest of that paragraph should serve to answer the question, why is that your conclusion, provided that we have one in the paragraph.
You know, the only reason I mention this is that my students, when I give them these strategies, sometimes they say, what if I just don't know? You know, I can't answer the question. I don't know if it's a fact or an opinion. I don't know what the main point is. And my response to that is always, even when you're wrong, you're right. The important thing is to ask the question, not to always come up with the perfect answer. And so when I'm giving this analysis as I go, is that a fact or is that an opinion? There's some push and pull here. That's my point, that it's not always something I can just, you know, objectively do and mow right through the passage.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, the last thing I wanted to point out here was I've got a diagram of this that I wish I included, which is that once I've got all my main points identified in each paragraph, what I do is I conceptually imagine taking those main points, sort of picking them up and creating a new paragraph with them or a new argument. And I literally read them off again, the 3 or 4 or 5 main points that I've underlined or identified. And by rereading them, I give myself a running start at my pre-phrase for the main point question.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we do this, right? It's the same thing. It's conclusion, conclusion, conclusion in your 3 paragraphs, and you put them all together and they create their own argument.
Right, and so the correct answer to the main point question is going to be whichever answer choice looks most like this. It will be some summary that encapsulates as much of the information on the screen now as possible and as little else as, as possible. Okay, 2 more things that I want to talk about. Blind review, I've got one quick thing about this. Look, one of the questions earlier was, how do you get better at this? What if you can't interpret it? What if you can't paraphrase quickly? And my response to that question is always, I never got fast at anything by rushing through it. And my evidence from that, just like Jake's background comes from music. If you gave me an incredibly fast etude to play, I would learn it very, very slowly. And then I would get my metronome and crank it up a little bit and crank it up a little bit. And eventually I'd get to that performance speed, but I wouldn't do it by playing it in a crappy manner at performance speed from the beginning, or at least that's not how I've been instructed to learn music. It's not how the good musicians I know learn things. They start slow and build. They don't demand speed when that causes a sacrifice in the quality. So I believe that there is a time for timed testing. And, if you guys take my triple review webinar, you know that I think like every section you do, there should be a timed beginning to the process. But when you get to the blind review, that's where you really learn how to find these main points, how to paraphrase. So here's my tips for blind review. For each paragraph, when you go back to blind review, reread each paragraph and identify the main points again. It should be a new process so that you are reanalyzing and you might actually come to different conclusions than you did on your timed test. I did a passage with a student a couple of days ago. This is so disconcerting. I had all the main points underlined in my book. I'm the only one who's ever written in this book. Obviously, I did it. When I prepped for the meeting with her, I came up with an entirely different set of sentences that I thought represented the main points of those paragraphs. And I'm just shaking my head thinking, what poor student got this crap? But it goes back to my point that I don't think that it was that essential that I had identified the main point. It was more essential that I had thought about the relationships between those ideas and was able to kind of comprehend the map of the passage. Where is each thing addressed and how? Okay, so when you're blind reviewing, I want you to take each paragraph and try to find the main point. You use the tricks from the previous slide. Once you find it, there's an extra step that makes you good at paraphrasing, and that is you rewrite it in your own words, and I force my students to write it down frequently. Cole will tell you, he sends me 15 text messages a day of his work because I tell him, no, I need the accountability. Show me what you've done. And on the RC passages, we're writing out main points, and I ask my students, once you've got the main point written down, I want you to start to pare it down. You don't have to get it into 7 words immediately. Usually we'll write one down. When I'm doing this with students, we're at 10 words. And I'll say, okay, what can we cut out? What words can we combine together? And we get out of it. All the grammatical jargon's gone. All the articles are gone. I mean, it's just the essentials. It's like, man discovers fire. And And so we pare it down to 7 words by using briefer language, by getting rid of filler words, and then also by sometimes you just have to make decisions about what to cut. You have to say, look, I've got no more room here. I have 3 ideas. One of them has to go. I have to make a decision and prioritize which of these 2 are more important than the third. And it's a very tough game. I almost find it to be like a logic game. It's super fun for me. It turns working these paragraphs into sort of this interactive exercise that I do with my student, and we end up debating these somewhat, and they come at it from a different angle, and we have different ways of thinking about that main point sentence, and so it becomes an interesting jumping off point. This step is the too long didn't read. You're trying to condense down to 7 words that one sentence that you think describes the main point. Now, the next step is I replace the complex words with synonyms. And this is where I think you get even better at the paraphrasing. This is the explain it like on 5, anything technical, mixture, reference frames, blah, blah, blah. I'm just gonna make that how it makes sense to me. And if it makes no sense to me, it's that crazy thing. You know, it's L enzymes or the P field or the whatever, the X rays. You wanna jump in, Jake?
Yeah, I just, for those who have, read The Loophole, you'll remember that Ellen spends her first chapter or 2 talking about rhetoric and talking about sentence structure and talking about the ways in which sentences are constructed and then made confusing by LR. But there's a lot of really powerful stuff in there. And one of the things to remember is that when you're trying to condense language, you have to take the low-hanging fruit first. Find anything parenthetical, right? Stuck between 2 commas. That's just describing the subject of the sentence. Get rid of that. Any prepositional phrases, anything after and of, you get rid of that, right? Ultimately, what you're really doing is diagramming the sentence. What is the subject? What is the main verb, right? And choose an adjective or a noun that it's related to, right? Some object if there's an object there. But really, you're taking all of these complexities, all of these descriptors, and get rid of them all because you don't need them. Right? What you need is the subject and the verb and the object of the verb, either the direct or indirect object, and maybe a descriptor or 2 to give it flavor. But that's all, right? And the rest of it is fluff. So if you think back, I don't know who remembers diagramming sentences, whether any of you have ever diagrammed a sentence. I barely learned it when I was in high school. But if you've got any experience with that, or if you have read any of the stuff that talks about the language in LR that way, that's one approach to doing TLDR that can help you to sort of find the core of the meaning of the sentence. Anyway.
That's fascinating, Jake. You know, you and I have talked about strategies for improving reading skills. And that's one thing that we juggled around with sentence diagramming. And I truly didn't realize that that was kind of at the core of the TLDR, is that you're trying to shed the prepositional and the subordinate clauses and the descriptive phrases of that main point and get to the main thrust of the sentence. And then if you add step 2, you know, finding the synonyms, I don't know what else there could be to paraphrasing. You know, you've chosen different language and you've simplified the concepts. That's the definition of paraphrasing. And so here's the way to practice it on a very slow level. And what I found, you know, when I started doing this with students, I tell this story frequently. This was years ago. It was an exercise that I was doing based on a book for a class I was teaching. And I was pretty arrogant about the whole thing. And I thought, well, maybe this is great for the 150 scores, but a 170 scorer like me doesn't need this kind of stuff. And after teaching for years and then assessing where I was at the end of those couple of years, I thought, man, was I dumb to think that I was so great at reading. I had become so much better at reading things and instantly paraphrasing them because I had gone through this really laborious process with my classes over and over again. That was a real enlightening moment for me, where I'd gone back to fundamentals, where I thought I was way beyond this, did it for a long period of time with my classes, and then came away believing, wow, I am a much better reader because I took the time to do that. And I tell that story because I want my students to realize that when I tell them, hey, go blind review this section for a day, and they're like, all my friends are doing 4 prep tests a week. You want me to sit here and read these passages for 2 hours each? And I'm like, yes. And it's because I personally believe that that fundamental work of doing things that seemed below my abilities really built my abilities up. Maybe I was deluding myself. There were holes that I couldn't, I didn't have the self-awareness to identify, and that fixed them, let me tell you.
Well, simple analogy, right? Once you're strong enough and fit enough and you're the guy that hosts that insanity workout and you can do those crazy burpees, does that mean that planking doesn't work anymore? Is it not good for you anymore, right? Planks are still super, super valuable even to the fittest people, right? And we, as people who have been steeped in standardized testing for ages and ages, it's almost more valuable for me to go back to the basics, go back to the deep fundamentals, because I forget sometimes. I'm looking for all these tiny complexities and things. That's why, everybody who's heard me talk before hears me rail about PowerScore. It's not that I think it's bad. It's just that it's communicating the wrong thing. It's getting you to start seeing everything as a complex, tiny differences between everything, so that you have this huge encyclopedia of knowledge, when what you really need is to find how everything's the same. Why is LG the same as reading? Why is LR the same as reading? Why do I approach answering all these questions the same way? Why is it always what or why, right? Everything's got to be those things, because I want to approach it the same way and get to the same basics so that I can get to the right answers.
So I want to talk now a little bit about blind reviewing the passage as a whole. This is a subject that came up when I was meeting with Cole this morning, because he's finalizing his prep for the October test in a few weeks. He's got LG and LR really locked up, and this RC section is giving him some trouble. So we're trying to see, well, can we get a few strategies in place to get a few more points before, before the fifth. And I promised him that I was going to make this template. And so I want to explain the next few bullet points. These were really inspired by the Manhattan Prep RC book. If you're not testing in October and you have a little more time, I might suggest picking that up if you're looking for a different perspective on RC. What it did for me, even after years of teaching the test, is that it really framed for me that the RC passages could always be broken down into this sort of a binary dynamic of one position versus another. And that idea really, really resonated with me, because I thought that it was basically the dynamic of almost every legal opinion that I read in law school. And so I started to, instead of use their scale analogy, I started saying, okay, well, let's imagine that each of these passages is a legal opinion that you're going to read for law school. And, for this copyright case, you're going to have to learn about literary theory. Even though you're a judge and you couldn't care one bit about literary theory, that's what has to happen in order for you to decide whether this book violated the copyright of that book. We treat it this way, where we have to learn these arguments in order to become sort of steeped in the information to make decisions about the arguments. And that, to me, gives it a more interesting perspective, where I say, all right, I may not personally care about this topic, but I can get into the debate. That sort of happened to me with Shakespeare, Jake. I found Shakespeare to be sort of boring and impenetrable. But when I found out there was a mystery about the authorship, I was back in big time. That was very appealing to me. Yeah. So I find this to be really interesting. As soon as two people disagree, I'm into it. I want to know why. And so my first order of business on the passages is to separate the parties. What do I think are the lines of this argument? This is something that I'm going to create a template and ask my students to do after each paragraph. Can you start to identify the fault lines of the dispute? X versus Y. Who are the parties? And I shouldn't say who. I mean, what are the different positions? The positions in the previous passage, I've never seen that one before, where like, is electromagnetism, is it electricity or is it a magnetism? And it seemed like the framework was going to be, well, it's electricity or magnetism, but then it was a really complex passage and they flipped it up on us. They said, actually those two positions, they're both wrong. The real dynamic is that we've got electricity versus magnetism, that debate over here. And then we've got the more enlightened crowd over here who said, it's actually both. It's not a debate, an either or debate. And so we shift the poles of the debate as we work through the passage. Initially, I thought it was magnetism versus electricity debate. But as we got to the end, I started to realize that wasn't the debate at all. Both of those positions were rejected, and therefore they both fall on the side of the V of the loser. And the winner was Einstein, really. Right. Okay. So we've got now our positions. What are the two positions on each side of the V in this case? Now we group the arguments. What are the arguments for position 1? What are the arguments for position 2? And different passages will lay those out in different levels of complexity, just like a legal opinion. There are some legal opinions that go into great level of detail for both of the parties' arguments. The plaintiff argued this, the defendant argued that, the appellate court came up with all of these machinations, and now finally here's what we want to do. There are other opinions where the court is so convinced that one of the parties is right, they basically only address the arguments for that party, and the other party is kind of absent in the opinion. They're just hidden back there versus this other guy who disagreed. And so sometimes that's the nature of the disagreement. And so they've given me this really long description. I told Jake this. I think even a purely descriptive passage still falls along this fault line, because you say, okay, well, if the author thinks that's the description of the world, then the competing point is every other description.
And by the way, in that, and those who read that Juno 7 number 4 about the Irish landscape is a good example of this, is that in those descriptive paragraphs, that debate will likely only be addressed in that first descriptive paragraph of the passage, right? That descriptive paragraph will tell you about the context of the world, and it will narrow itself to the thesis. And if the thesis is only one side of the argument, the rest of the argument is just, you know, the thing that was addressed in that first introductory paragraph. So even in a descriptive paragraph, there's still a conflict. It's just that the thesis of the thing is right at the beginning, and there's no further debate.
So then the final thing that I want to do, just like when I'm reading a legal opinion, I have to know who the parties are. I like to understand what the arguments are that frame the debate. But ultimately, the most important thing to me is, what did the judge say? The judge of these passages is the author. And so I want, as I work through each paragraph, to not just frame the debate and group the arguments, but then ultimately think about where the author's telling me the stronger arguments lie. And that might be based on the structure. How did he order them? It might be based on him just flat out telling me these guys turned out to be right. You know, there's different levels of signals that the author can provide, but I need to find them and ultimately decide how the author came down on the dispute. All right, I've got one more slide, very brief one, and then we'll open it up for some questions, or Jake can take you guys through an exercise, whatever he wants to do. All right, so the strategy review, if you guys know my triple review, I think that after you've done your blind review, someone asked how to do blind review, I do it timed, do not look up the answers. I simply repeat the entire section untimed without the benefit of the correct answers, and I rework the process of answering all the questions. And one of the reasons I think this makes you better is that I tell my students, the first time you do a passage, game, whatever, you're basically just trying to keep your head above water. You're drowning, and you're lucky if you can swim. The second time you do it, you gain more conceptual understanding of the problem. The third time, the strategy review, that's when you truly understand how the problem works. And now you can start to think about, whoa, how could I get to that answer quicker? You know, this is the third time through the logic game where you say, wow, drawing it that way caused me to waste a bunch of time. I did it wrong twice. Now I'm going to fix it and do it the better way. So on the strategy review, here's some of the things that I do to analyze the questions. When you finally look up the answers, right after your blind review, you've kind of exhausted, I think, your own ability to get to the heart of the questions. Now you need the answers to start to steer you in the right direction. When you get the right answer to the questions you've missed, you need to start to jot down or think about, what are the merits of that answer? The things that I didn't appreciate, that and you know, the things I should have noticed but didn't when I was debating. Also try to articulate the demerits of the wrong answer. What's wrong with it? And I kind of classify these into two categories: semantic demerits, words that are too strong or out of scope that would make the answer wrong no matter what else it said. And then logical things. That is, what if we fix the semantics and bring them back in line with the passage? Would that question answer that particular, would that answer that particular question? If no, then it doesn't just have a semantic problem, it also has some logical problem, not the right kind of answer for that kind of question. And you can start thinking about why not? And why did I fall for that? And so here's the exercise that I truly love. I've been doing this all week with a bunch of students. When anyone comes to me with a question and says, can you explain this to me, Keith? You can be guaranteed that the next thing I'm going to shoot back to them is, I'll do it, but you have to tell me how to turn your wrong answer into a right one. And then I'm going to know if I taught you the lesson or not. And so what I tell students is, you get 3 options to do this. You have to go back and look at your wrong answer and say, okay, can I change a detail in that answer choice that would change it correct? That's easy when it's just like a semantic problem. Can I change a detail in the passage that would make the answer correct? Or is there something about the question that would, if I could change the question to another question type, would that easily switch it to a correct answer? And sometimes you have to do more than one thing. I was doing this with one of our participants a day or 2 ago, and the answer to the question was, we have to take a sufficient assumption question and turn it into a necessary assumption question. That's fixing the logic. And we have to take a few of the words and massage them a little bit. That's fixing the semantics of the answer choice. And once we've done both of those things and fixed it, and we've turned that wrong answer into a right one, that I think really demonstrates a real mastery of the content, the question, and the whole like the nature of the exam. And so I push my students all the way to that point. If you can't do that, I'm not satisfied yet.
Yeah. And this is something to be done. You know, the other part of strategy review that I think is really critical is strategy review is your opportunity to flesh out literally everything at your disposal, right? You use all your resources. You take all the time you need, right? It's not just about blind review. It's about everything. But this is the time to take out your scrap paper and say, I'm going to hold myself accountable, right? And I'm going to do what my tutor would ask me to do. And I'm going to write down the conclusion to every single paragraph. I'm going to identify it. There it is. I'm going to condense it. I'm going to write it down. Now I'm going to simplify it. I'm going to write it down again. Now I'm going to take all of my newly paraphrased and simplified sentences, and I'm going to put them all into one paragraph, and it's going to form a cohesive argument. And then I'm going to go question by question. I'm going to say, which ones did I get wrong, and which ones did I get right through blind review, and why? Here again, we're scripting our own dialogue, right? The reason why tutoring is so powerful is because Keith and I can be in a room or in a Zoom room with you, and we can script this for you and walk you through the process of discovering these things, discovering the reasons why and why not. What students for years have asked me for, which of course is impossible, is to create a bobblehead with a little pull string in the back that they can put on their desk and that they can pull when they're in a bind because they don't know what to do, and say, what would Jake say? What would he ask me? And I wouldn't be giving answers. If we're giving answers, we're not doing our job as a tutor. Our job is to ask insightful questions so that you can reach the answers on your own. So you have to think about what questions we would ask you. Have you rephrased the question for yourself? Have you condensed the paragraph in a right way that you've got all your signposts? Because if you can't figure out what the demerits of your wrong answer are, it means you don't understand what's going on in the paragraph well enough. And look, if the paragraph had really complex language or concepts, all the more reason to create a treasure map for yourself and say, let me get rid of all of the concepts. Let me replace them with placeholders. Even if I don't understand what's going on, can I create a convincing treasure map that gets me to those answers anyway? And if that's true, then what you realize is that you don't need all that technical knowledge. What you really need is a great map for what's happening. And then you can discover the logical inconsistencies. We do it in LR. We do it with every LR question. We don't understand those things, and we don't have to. We have to understand how they're put together. That's what's vital.
You know, building this treasure map, Jake, it kind of reminds me of a student learning how to diagram a logic game, where we're asking you to do something that is potentially impossible for you today, but it's something that you can learn how to do. And if you commit to learning how to do it, it will give you a tool that allows you to answer questions in a way you never could before. I mean, think about how true that is for logic games. What if you just refuse to diagram a logic game? That's kind of similar to refusing to build the treasure map that we're describing. You know, what are your other options for organizing and summarizing that passage in a way that, you know, gives you a framework to use when you get to the questions? I don't know of a better one. It's one of the reasons I teamed up with Jake, because I've struggled with that exact question for many years, and I liked the framework that he was teaching.
Yeah. And actually, you know, one of the things we haven't talked about this, but one of the things that I think is really can be very, very helpful for somebody really struggling with RC on this test. You know, if you're in a position where you're getting 4 or 5 right, and you're really struggling to penetrate this stuff, one of the things I've had people do is go and download a bunch of SATs, right? That you go and get the SAT and you demonstrate to yourself that you understand how this works on a test for whom in which the language is less complex and less jargony and less technical. And you realize that the way that they construct it on the SAT is exactly the same. They're still asking you the same things. They give you some more hints on the SAT. They point you to line numbers more often. The paragraphs are usually better constructed in terms of their in terms of the conclusions and where they are in each paragraph, where those topic sentences are. But generally, your process is the same. You read it, you map it for yourself, you rephrase the questions that you read, you prephrase the answers in the paragraph, and then you go find the answer choice that best represents the thing that you just prephrased. And if you can go and do it on the SAT, and you can do it with proficiency on the SAT and prove that to yourself over and over again, coming back to the LSAT, you've already got your technique there, right? You're doing it every time. And then you say, okay, fine, now I have to apply it to something more complex. But take out some of the complexity and do a simpler passage at first so that you're not worried about the jargon yet, so that you can make sure that this isn't a technical thing. Because if you can't do the technique correctly on something simpler, you're certainly not going to be able to do it here.
That's always my point about the blind review too, is that I don't know how anyone hopes to be able to do it on a timed test until they've demonstrated to themselves that they could do it untimed. And so for me, that's always the first step to building the confidence, and then recognizing that not only can I do it untimed, but I can start to identify patterns and ways to, you know, to chip away at the time. That's how you get better.
Yeah, this is why, I mean, look, you know, you go back to high school pedagogy. Why is it that you do homework? You do homework so that you can demonstrate to yourself that you can get every question right with your resources in front of you with as much time as you need. Then you go into class and you're given examples to do, which you don't have all the time that you need, but you still have your resources. And until you can do that and do that with proficiency, why are you trying to go to the test to try to do everything from the chapter in 45 minutes? Right? The first thing to do is go prove to yourself that you can get an entire linear game correct. Take 3 hours, I don't care. Write out as much stuff as you need to. Write out every iteration, do every brute force method you need. And the same is true with reading comprehension. If you can't get all the answers after having identified every conclusion, paraphrased it in your own words, right? Done TLDR and ELI5 on every conclusion in the entire passage, then gone back and sought out the answer choice in every case, right? Put a mark next to exactly where you found the answer to that question. If you can't do that in 2 hours, you're not going to be able to do it in 35 minutes. So
we better open it up to questions. We've only got 15 minutes and we'll have to bounce.
Yeah. So if people have here, I'm going to scroll back here because we had a couple of questions in the chat. So I did a passage on Khan Academy and I understood the passage, but I got all the questions wrong. I tried not to highlight and write nothing down, but it failed me. I do better highlighting and underlining. This has been a question that's come at us a lot recently because of Flex. And you know, the tablets have really bad interfaces, and so that's hard to deal with. But as we discovered very recently, if you're doing it with a mouse and you're doing it on a PC or on a Mac, you have the ability to highlight. Do we advocate doing it? Well, that's going to be personal, right? Like, how good are you at using your mouse and using the interface quickly? And is it something that helps you? But you're not going to know until you try it. So if I'm a big believer in pencil and paper, right? I dislike digital testing for a lot of reasons. One of which is that I think there's a lot of power to pencil to paper, and scrap paper is not the same thing. But this is what we've got, right? So we have to figure out how to navigate the paradigm as well as we can. And if highlighting is powerful for you, try using the interface and highlighting the thing. Or try using shorthand on your scrap paper, right? Write down a couple of key words of where you think it is, or, second sentence of the first paragraph, main conclusion, right? Whatever it takes to note take in a way that's powerful for you, that you have to test it out and see if it works for you.
One of the questions here was how many passages to do. And, it's totally personal, but I think that it underscores one of the reasons why my triple review process always begins with a time test. And that's because if we ask that question based only on the blind review process, an untimed review of the questions, or only based on a strategy review, we're missing a key piece of the information, which was, how did you actually perform given your current strategy? And so I know that it's self-defeating to some extent. My students will tell me, I don't want to do a time test because I already know I'm not good at this. But in order to answer the question of how many passages can you do on a time test, the answer is, I don't know. You have to time yourself and tell me, how many did you do? How did it go? And then we adjust from there. If it was a disaster and you tried all 4, we try 3. If you tried 3 and you had plenty of time left over, we go to 4. If 3 was still a disaster, we go to 2. We find whatever level you're at using those time tests, and then use the blind review and the strategy review to slowly improve. But I'll tell you this, in all the years that I've been teaching, I've never had a student adopt a new strategy complete from me or PowerScore or anyone else, implement it instantly, and then immediately be good at the LSAT. There was always a period of gradual growth and development that was largely based on their starting point. And so that's my answer to it, is you'll have to give me more information. What's going on your time tests, what's going on your blind review, and then we strategize that third step together. I do that frequently with students.
And that last thing that you said is super, super important, because it's really important to recognize that growth is not linear. Growth does not have a constant slope, right? And when we're presented with new information and new techniques, we have to absorb them, understand them, dig into the concepts, and then try to implement them. And depending on where we are, who we are, and what that concept is, not only may you not see growth right away, you may see regression at first, right? I made this point to Keith the other day about golf, right? If you take an athletic person and you put them in front of a golf ball, they can swing a club and probably hit the thing. They're not going to be that good, but they're going to be able to do it. If you give them a teacher who tells them, no, you've done this all wrong, they're going to spend weeks just missing the ball for a while until they figure it out again. They'll get better, but it's going to take some time. So if you've been going about logic, I spoke to somebody the other day who said that they've been doing logic games entirely in their head and hadn't mapped a thing. And I said, look, it's okay that you've been doing that, because it means you understand what's going on with games. But if you want to master games, you're going to have to learn how to diagram on paper. And when you do that, you're going to get slower and you're going to make mistakes for a while until you get good at it. So you're going to go from wherever you are now at -7 or -10, and you might regress for a while. But once you master the technique, you'll get better. This is true of reading comp. There's no denying it. This is true of reading comp, and we need to be able to take a look at reading comp and say there is something more tangible about this than we've been making it out to be. And that's why we create these maps. They're not things to do on the test, right? We don't do this on the test. We don't, on a logic game, you wouldn't attempt to write out the entire world. But there are techniques out there that say, on a blind review or on a strategy review, right, if you're really trying to dissect the game, I want you to write out every iteration, right? Just do it and find out what you discover from doing that. It's not a thing to do on the test, and I wouldn't want you to write by hand the entire treasure map for a reading comp in a timed section, but in a third review, especially for one you struggled with, absolutely. And Caroline asked, do you change the way that you do blind review over the course of your LSAT journey? Yeah, yes and no. I mean, we've been we've been having this debate this last month about sort of the value of reviewing the right answers and the wrong, and when it's important. And again, it's pretty personal. We had a conversation a couple weeks ago with somebody who was having a hard time and was sort of emotionally struggling with the test as it was leading into her test date. And I said, one of the really positive things you can take from this is you need to start looking at your successes, right? If you're constantly looking only at the things that you're getting wrong, if you're framing the way you do based on your wrong answers, right? We all talk about that, talk about it in that way. -5, -8 on a section. Well, what about 20 out of 25? I got 20 of them right. And even more than that, on my blind review, I got 20 right, where I only got 14 right timed. What did I do different for those 6? What worked? Right? And so there is wisdom in continuing to blind review an entire section. I know Keith says, for reading comp, when you get to sort of the third time through, if you've perfected the passage, if you got everything right on blind review, chances are you understood it all. But there is a difference between getting the right answer and knowing why the right answer is right. And you have to be honest with yourself about that. That's, again, the deep value in having Keith in the room with you is he's always going to ask you why you answered that. And you have to hold yourself accountable to the same thing. You have to say, why did I answer that? Did I answer it because I actually knew? Or did I answer it because I was down to 2 and didn't know what the right answer was and I guessed? And how many times did I guess like that? That's not mastery. That's proficiency with a bit of luck. So it's hard to say don't strategy review, don't blind review things that you get perfect until you're really getting them through mastery, which, that's a long way from the beginning of your journey. So I don't think there's a huge change in the way you blind review. It should still be, untimed, spend as much time as you need to really ensure that you get every answer right that you can.
I think what changes is that you just get so much better at answering the questions that it doesn't take as long, but the process itself is the same. You give yourself unlimited time and a willingness to use any kind of diagramming or mental tool to answer the question. And then once you're satisfied that you've got an answer, you do the next one. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, there's an interesting question that I actually don't know the answer to. You were looking at Law Hub today. Does the digital interface on Law Hub show the line numbers?
No, but it is interesting when you get to the question that asks about a specific part of the passage, it highlights it for you. And so
GRE does the same.
I mean, it's pretty cool. And the other thing is I found was that I think that the underline feature works very well. I've been telling students for a while, stop underlining, go to highlighting. Now that I kind of know how it works better, I'm going to go back to underlining because that's my conclusion. That's been for many years. That's been my tag for conclusions. There is one question I want to address here about the timeliness of doing all this. And there's another question here about whether I still paraphrase mentally during a time section. And so I'll say this, that I've observed a progression in my own thinking that has been very similar in logic games and LR and now in RC2. And that's that when I adopt methods that I think are intended for my students and not for me, like diagramming conditional statements, it ends up changing the way that I think about those concepts. And so, you asked, do I paraphrase now? I would say not in the same deliberate way that I used to, where it's a separate step of my process, but that's because I've done it so much that I don't read anything without paraphrasing it now. That is part of the way that I read. I look at words and I come up with this array of different ways to say the same thing and different synonyms for those words. And it's not intentional anymore. It's because I've done so many damn LSAT passages with hundreds and hundreds of students that it's like going to the gym. Could you work out every day and then at the end say, I don't know if I'm stronger? I did it every day. Am I better at it to the point where I can do it so quickly that it's a feasible method on time tests? Yes, the answer is yes. I paraphrase everything, every single thing I read.
And actually, if you guys asked my wife, she would tell you that I mumble to myself like a crazy person whenever I work on LSATs, because I'm having this conversation with myself actively. while I do it. I do it on reading passages. I do it on LR. I do it on games. I talk to myself. And the reason I talk to myself is that if you leave it inside your head, you allow yourself not to commit to ideas. You don't hold yourself accountable to the ideas that you have. When you make them verbal, when you verbalize them and you make them more tangible, you then have to commit to the idea. This, again, harkens back to the SAT because I don't have this on LSAT, but this has to do with the idea of sentence completions, right? That you're given a context in a sentence for a word that's missing. And the only way to get there is by talking through to yourself what has to be there based on what's already there. But you have to have the conversation. What are they saying? What's present in the sentence that informs that blank? And it's the same in RC, right? What's the conclusion? Why is it the conclusion? Is this evidence for that conclusion? Ask yourself those questions actively. Be the crazy person in your own office and have the conversation. Hold yourself accountable to doing it right. And when it comes to paraphrasing, at every step, I'm constantly explaining the sentence that I read to myself, especially since that sentence is jargon that I'm not expert at. I'm certainly not masterful at, but I'm likely a beginner at most of these topics, even though I know a lot of the words. There are a lot of questions here. I want to make sure I get to them all. The progression occurs from paraphrasing each sentence in the passage to paraphrasing paragraphs, because this will be too timely to do. No, I think we really do paraphrase everything. It's that you paraphrase as you read, but that you identify conclusions as you go. I think those happen in tandem. Jessica asked, do you recommend guessing D for the passages not completed? Statistically, it really doesn't matter. If you're not completing a passage, you're guessing. It's not going to matter whether you answer D or B or pepper the page with whatever you want. It's not going to make a difference. So
Guess
don't worry about
something.
it too much. Yeah.
Don't leave a blank.
Yeah, absolutely guess on everything and leave yourself that 15 seconds to do it. Information on removal of fluff. So if you look at the first couple of chapters of Loophole, she talks about rhetorical structure. So if you have that book, she talks about it in there. But I'll put together a couple of resources for how to identify subjects and verbs and sort of predicate parts. We shouldn't go through an entire course of diagramming sentences, though maybe we should. I don't know, that it might not be a terrible idea. But I'll put together a couple of things and I'll send it out to you guys. How do you get better at understanding what the question is asking? That's the main problem. So to know what the question is asking, you have to ask yourself, is this question asking me what, why, or how, right? Because that's almost always what the question is asking you. What, why, or how. And it's usually what or why, right? Either what does it say about this thing or why is it saying it? If you need more information than that, if the questions are hard to penetrate for that reason, one of the things you can do is you can go to your resources, the ones that do explanations, and try to boil down the question type from the explanation that they give you. So if, LSAT Hacks has a good explanation for a reading comp question and they talk about the question itself, see if you can determine from that, was this a what question? What does it say in the passage? Or a why question? Why did it say it? And remember that why did it say it is what role does it play in the deductive framework? Is it a conclusion? Is it a premise? Is it evidence, right? That's almost always the answer to why. Why is it there? Why do we even need it?
And one of the best things you guys can do to get better at all of this is to let us model it for you in our class that starts Monday.
Yeah. One other question that was on here, can you talk to yourself on the flex? The answer is no. You're not supposed to be able to talk to yourself. I have heard stories of proctors letting you get away with doing it, but you're not supposed to be able to. So that's why we try to model the behavior at home so that we get good at doing it and then we can internalize it. On Keith's note, just so you guys know, we are starting this great group class on Monday. We've got Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern. We're taking a group through 3 practice tests over the course of 12 sessions. It's going to be a different format from this. We're going to have fewer people. It's going to be deeply collaborative and interactive. And the objective is to get everybody to do their timed and blind review of the same section in the day or two before the class, so that they can submit those answers. We can take some data, find out where people struggled, and address those struggles in the class together over the course of an hour. And you'll have both of us for the hour for those 12 sessions. It's going to be really, really great. I think we have some attendees for the class in the webinar tonight. So that's coming up. Because of that, it's going to be hard for us to do any further webinars for a little while, though we'll talk about how to do more. Maybe we can do a repeat of some of the previous ones. The one we did on LR is great. We've done that one a couple times, and the one we did on triple review, which was also fantastic. The other thing that we've been talking about is creating some small groups to do sections or tests together. 4 or 5 people that are in a similar place and are having similar struggles. So if people are interested in small group tutoring, in addition to one-on-one, obviously we'll do one-on-one tutoring, but small group can be sort of a more collaborative and interactive atmosphere, and benefiting from your peers, which, my background in pedagogy is very much a flipped classroom. You don't learn by listening, you learn by doing. And so to watch other people doing and to help other people to do is the best way. So if anybody is interested in finding a small group to work together with, let us know, and we're going to try to put some of those together as well. Will we do another 12-week session? Yes, we've been talking about it. We haven't locked it in yet. We don't know what the dates will be. We're going to try to get it in before the January test, so that'll certainly apply to February as well. Keith, anything to add?
No, I'm just so excited about the October class that I want to encourage everyone. If you think that is something you might be interested in, particularly November takers, reach out to us, because we want to kind of talk about it before you pay and make sure that this is the right thing for you. And so that takes a little time to get going. And there's some homework for the first class on Monday. So realistically, we've only got a couple more days to sell this. And so if you think you want to do it, you gotta talk to us quickly, or you're gonna miss your shot. So reach out soon.
And for those who are on the call who are in the October class, we're going to start with test 73. We're going to do 73, 74, and 75. So make sure you've got access to the test. And we'll send out an email in the next day or two about what we're doing and what the schedule is going to be. But we're going to be starting with that first LR section in 73, and we'll figure out how to communicate which one that is, because we know that it's weird on LawHub. It's different from the printed test. So we'll send out info on that.
I guess the other thing I'll mention is that I had steered away from classes for a long time because I thought that students would fall through the cracks, and that when you have 30 students, you have to make the practical choice to do what's best for the group and not to fall behind. But I really believe that we're going to be able to give everyone a lot of personal attention with both of us teaching every class. And so I've kind of changed my opinion on whether I think a classroom format is something I want to do or can work for my students. So I really hope you guys will consider that.
Are we going to go over the landscape passage? We are 2 hours in here, and I apologize that, we both got very wordy. Show of hands, anybody who wants to stay on and just talk about that landscape passage. I'm glad to stay on if people want to do it. If that's something that people want, well, we can certainly stick around. In the meantime, if you do want to be interested in the class, you got an email from us yesterday if you signed up. I'm going to send an email again tomorrow with a link to the video of the class. So you'll have my email address, and I'm going to put my email address here in the chat so you guys have it. Feel free to reach out by email or reach out on Facebook if you want. There's also, I don't know if we put the link for the October class on Facebook or not. I don't think we did. But email me, and I'm glad to send you the link for the class, or we can start chatting about whether whether the class is the right thing for you. And we'll set up a video chat with one of us.
And the passage, you know, if you guys want to reach out and ask questions about it, I can't refuse an LSAT discussion. So
Yeah. You know, very quickly with regard to that Juno 7 passage, right? I would encourage you guys, you know, it's going to take a while to do it. So doing it now doesn't make sense. But if you take the frameworks that we talked about tonight and you go back to that Juno 7 passage, you're going to see just how quickly you're able to say, oh, this is a descriptive paragraph. Here's a conclusion. Here a topic sentence for these two paragraphs. And then they go on to use evidence. You're going to be able to map it so fast. And you're going to realize how much of that information is extraneous. So tell you what I'll do. Give it a shot on your own with that Juno 7 Irish landscape passage. And then reach out and let me know how you do. Feel free to send me an email or chat me on Facebook. I'd love to hear feedback on how it worked for you the first time and what your insights are. And Keith and I will see if we can steer you the right way.
and if you guys enjoyed this, if it was helpful, please let people know in the Facebook groups and let your friends know. We're going to continue to do webinars, classes, private tutoring, and anything we can think of to help you guys, but we need to get the word out. And so your help is very much appreciated on that front.
Absolutely. And like we said, you know, anytime reach out and we're glad to chat. Thanks so much for coming. We hope you enjoyed it and look for an email from me tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks.